We need to get her to the emergency room now.
Clear the way.
Sometimes the people society looks down on are the very ones who rise to save lives. A poor black worker, often ignored and mistreated, suddenly found himself at the center of a life-or-death race against time. With every second ticking away, a child's future depended on his courage. But what he did next left even the wealthiest and most powerful people speechless. How could one unexpected act completely shatter years of prejudice and force everyone to see him differently?
He was a man most people passed by without ever noticing. Working as a cleaner in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods of the city, his life was built around silence, shadows, and tasks no one else wanted to do. Every morning before the sun rose, he left his small, modest home tucked in the poorer side of town, taking a long bus ride into the world of towering glass mansions and private cars. His name was Samuel, and to him, dignity was found in the little things, keeping the marble floor spotless, wiping fingerprints from glass doors, emptying trash bins filled with the leftovers of wealth. While others ignored him, or worse, treated him as if he didn't exist, he quietly carried on. The uniform he wore wasn't just a badge of his work. It was, in the eyes of the rich, a reminder of where they believed he belonged. For Samuel, life had always been a balancing act between hope and exhaustion. His wife had passed away years ago, leaving him to raise his young son alone. Every shift he took was not just for survival. It was for school fees, for food on the table, for giving his child a life better than the one society seemed determined to hand them. And yet, despite his loyalty and hard work, Samuel rarely received kindness. The wealthy families he worked for often brushed past him, eyes cold, voices sharp. To them, he was simply the cleaner, someone replaceable, someone invisible. Even the children sometimes mirrored their parents' disdain, wrinkling their noses or whispering when he walked by. But Samuel never complained. Instead, he prayed quietly under his breath every morning, asking for strength, patience, and the wisdom to endure. He believed that storms came to pass, not to stay. And though life had taught him about cruelty, he still clung to the belief that goodness could break through. This belief was tested often. He heard jokes made at his expense when people assumed he couldn't hear. He felt the sting of doors shut in his face when he tried to be helpful. And still, he carried himself with a quiet humility that confused some and irritated others. Why didn't he break? Why didn't he retaliate? The truth was, Samuel knew something they didn't. Life could change in an instant. And on one particular afternoon, inside a mansion larger than he could have ever imagined living in, that instant arrived. He was busy polishing the floor near the grand staircase, lost in thought, when a sudden piercing scream shattered the air. It was the kind of sound that freezes blood and makes the heart drop. Upstairs, a young girl, the millionaire's daughter, had collapsed, her small body trembling before going still. The mansion erupted into chaos, voices shouting, footsteps pounding. But in the blur of panic, no one expected Samuel to move. No one believed the man they barely acknowledged would be the first to act. What he did next would not only save a life, but also challenge everything the wealthy thought they knew about him.
Samuel's heart pounded as the scream echoed down the mansion halls. He dropped the mop, instincts taking over. Without hesitation, he rushed up the staircase, his heavy boots clashing against polished marble that wasn't meant for men like him. By the time he reached the landing, he saw the girl lying motionless on the floor, her lips pale, her small hands trembling before going limp. The wealthy guests froze in shock, their voices overlapping in panic. Some shouted for doctors, others screamed her name, but not one of them moved forward. Samuel, the man they considered invisible, was the only one who bent down, scooping her fragile body into his arms. "Wait, what are you doing?" a woman shrieked, her voice trembling with both fear and disdain. But Samuel didn't stop. He could feel how light she was, how shallow her breathing had become. Every second mattered. Without hesitation, he rushed up the staircase, his heavy boots clashing against polished marble that wasn't meant for men like him. By the time he reached the landing, he saw the girl lying motionless on the floor, her lips pale, her small hands trembling before going limp. The wealthy guests froze in shock, their voices overlapping in panic. Some shouted for doctors, others screamed her name, but not one of them moved forward. Samuel, the man they considered invisible, was the only one who bent down, scooping her fragile body into his arms. "Wait, what are you doing?" a woman shrieked, her voice trembling with both fear and disdain. But Samuel didn't stop. He could feel how light she was, how shallow her breathing had become. Every second mattered. Without a word, he pushed through the crowd, his mind fixed on the hospital he had passed countless times on the bus route. But even in this moment of urgency, prejudice bared its teeth. As he carried the girl toward the front door, a man in a tailored suit stepped in his path, his hand raised like a barrier. "You can't just take her. You'll make it worse. Put her down." The accusation was sharp, almost spitting. The man's eyes weren't filled with concern for the child. They were filled with suspicion of Samuel. Samuel's chest tightened, but he refused to stop. "She doesn't have time," he said, his voice low, controlled, almost pleading. But they didn't listen. More voices rose over him, questioning his right to intervene. He felt the sting of words like, "You're just the cleaner," and "Don't touch her, you'll hurt her." Each one cut deep, not because they were new, but because they echoed the same dismissal he had endured his entire life. But yet Samuel knew that if he listened, if he hesitated for even a moment, she might not survive. So he lowered his head and pushed forward. His arms tightened around her, as though protecting her not just from illness, but from the cruel voices trying to stop him. By the time he reached the driveway, chaos spilled outside. The girl's father, a man of power and wealth, appeared at the door. His face was pale, his voice broken. "My daughter, what happened?" he cried. But when his eyes landed on Samuel holding her, a storm of conflict crossed his expression. Relief, fear, distrust, and something else. Hesitation, born of prejudice. Samuel didn't wait for permission. He rushed toward the street, scanning desperately for help. But in this neighborhood, taxis were rare, and buses almost non-existent. His only choice was to run. And so he did. Through manicured gardens, past gleaming gates, down sidewalks where strangers turned to stare at the sight of a poor black worker carrying a wealthy white child in his arms. Whispers spread like fire. Some gasped, others pointed, and a few muttered accusations under their breath. Did he hurt her? Why is he running? No one stopped to ask the truth. They only saw the picture their prejudice painted. Samuel's legs burned, but he didn't stop. Every block stretched endlessly, every step a battle against both exhaustion and the piercing judgment in people's eyes. Behind him he heard shouting, the father, a few guests, even security guards calling after him, demanding he explain himself. But Samuel couldn't. Not yet, not until the girl was safe. Then, as if fate tested him further, he reached a busy intersection. Cars honked, brakes screeched, people shouted angrily as he darted across, clutching the child against his chest. A woman yelled from the sidewalk, "What's he doing with her?" And a man's voice followed, "Call the police." Samuel's heart sunk. He knew exactly how this looked. A black man, in a cleaner's uniform, carrying a white child who appeared unconscious. To strangers, it wasn't an act of rescue. It was a crime unfolding before their eyes. Still, he pressed on, his breath ragged, sweat streaking down his face. Just as sirens wailed faintly in the distance, Samuel saw it, the glowing red emergency sign of the hospital. He pushed harder, ignoring the stabbing pain in his legs. The girl's chest barely rose now, her face frighteningly still. Bursting through the hospital doors, Samuel shouted for help. Nurses rushed forward, doctors called for a stretcher, and in a blur of white coats, the girl was lifted from his arms. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Because as the medical team disappeared with the child, Samuel suddenly felt hands grip his shoulders. Spinning around, he saw two police officers, faces stern, eyes suspicious. "Sir, we need to ask what's going on," one said, his tone more accusation than concern. Behind them, the girl's father stormed into the hospital, shouting her name. His eyes locked on Samuel, and in that charged moment, everything hung in balance. Samuel had done everything to save her, but would they see his sacrifice or condemn him for the color of his skin?
The hospital's bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on Samuel's face as two police officers tightened their grip on his shoulders. His chest still heaved from the desperate sprint, his shirt damp with sweat, but all he could feel now was the cold bite of suspicion pressing against him like shackles. "Sir, you need to explain why you were carrying that child," one officer said, his voice low but edged with accusation. The words were sharp, cutting through Samuel's relief like glass. Samuel opened his mouth, but before he could answer, the girl's father burst through the sliding doors, his expensive shoes echoing against the tiles. His face was twisted with panic and fury, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Where is she? Where's my daughter?" The nurses hurried past with the stretcher, disappearing into the emergency ward, but the father's gaze locked on Samuel like a weapon. "You!" he roared, his finger stabbing the air. "What have you done to her?" The lobby froze. Patients waiting in chairs looked up. Staff paused mid-step. Every eye turned toward the cleaner in the faded uniform, now framed as the villain in a story no one had bothered to understand. I saved her," Samuel managed, his voice trembling, but steady enough to carry truth. But truth was not enough. Not here. Not against the weight of years of prejudice. The father surged forward, restrained only by one of the officers. "You expect me to believe that? My little girl in your arms, unconscious? You must have heard her. What were you planning?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs followed like a wave. Was he kidnapping her? What was a cleaner doing with a rich man's child? Maybe he wanted money. Samuel's stomach knotted. It was as if the very walls of the hospital leaned in, suffocating him with accusation. He wanted to scream, to shout the truth, that he had carried her when no one else would, that every second he ran was to save her life, not take it. But his voice felt small against the roar of suspicion. The officers exchanged glances. One of them muttered something into the radio clipped to his vest. Samuel's heart sunk. Were they calling for backup? Were they preparing to arrest him before the truth had even been given a chance to breathe? Then came the cruelest moment of all. The father, shaking with anger and grief, spat words Samuel would never forget. "Men like you don't save children like mine." The sentence landed heavier than any handcuff could. Centuries of injustice seemed to echo through that one line. It wasn't just about him, it was about every black man who had ever been judged before being heard, condemned before being seen. Samuel's knees threatened to buckle, but he forced himself to stand taller, his hands open, trembling, showing he had nothing to hide. He looked around the room, hoping for someone, anyone to speak up, to say they had seen him run, carrying the girl with care, desperation, and love. But silence stretched. Fear and prejudice held every tongue captive. The father demanded, "Arrest him now!" His voice cracked like a whip. The officers hesitated, their grip tightening on Samuel's arms. The world blurred for him. Sirens, voices, footsteps, it all blended into a suffocating haze. Then came the sudden interruption. The doors to the emergency room burst open and a doctor rushed out. His face was tense but calm, his voice sharp with urgency. "We stabilized her. She's going to be okay. Whoever brought her here saved her life." The words cut through the tension like a blade. Gasps spread again, but this time they carried disbelief, even guilt. The father froze, his expression faltering as though the ground had been ripped out beneath him. The officers loosened their hold on Samuel, but the sting of suspicion remained. The doctor's words hadn't erased the accusations, they only paused them. The room's energy shifted, but Samuel could still feel the weight of judgment pressing against him. For a split second, he thought maybe now, finally, the truth would set him free. But the father's pride, tangled with prejudice, was not ready to admit he was wrong. He stepped forward, his tone softer but still laced with venom. "If she lives, it's because of the doctors. Don't think your interference changes what you are." The sentence landed like a final blow. Even after risking everything, even after racing through streets with the world accusing him, he was still reduced to nothing more than his uniform and his skin. The officers stepped aside, no longer holding him, but their eyes still carried suspicion. Samuel stood in the middle of the lobby, his hands trembling, his heart raw, his spirit cracked. He had done everything right, yet he was treated as if he had committed the worst crime. And in that moment, Samuel realized something chilling. Saving a life hadn't changed how they saw him. Prejudice was deeper than deeds, stronger than truth. The doctor called for the father to come inside. He rushed past Samuel without even a glance, as if the man who had carried his daughter from the brink of death was nothing more than a shadow in the corner of the room. He watched him disappear behind the doors, his chest heavy with both relief and despair. The girl was safe. That's all that mattered. But the silence, the glares, and the whispers that still lingered told a different story. One of a man who had proven his worth, yet remained unseen. And as Samuel stood alone in that cold, glaring light, one question echoed louder than the rest, haunting and unresolved. If saving a child's life wasn't enough to change their view of him, what would ever be?
The father disappeared into the emergency room, leaving Samuel standing in the hospital lobby, surrounded by whispers, stares, and the suffocating weight of prejudice. His arms, once holding the fragile body of a child fighting for life, now hung empty at his sides. He should have felt relief. After all, the girl was alive, she was safe. But instead, what he felt most was an aching hollowness. He lowered himself into a chair tucked away in the corner of the lobby. The cleaner's uniform, damp with sweat and stained from the frantic run, clung to him like a reminder of the label that defined how the world saw him. People still looked his way, but not with gratitude. Their eyes held suspicion, discomfort, and shame disguised as silence. Minutes crawled by, each one slower than the last. Samuel closed his eyes and tried to steady his breath. He thought of his son, how hard he worked every day to give him a future filled with dignity and possibility. But tonight, after all that had happened, he wondered if dignity was something society would ever truly allow them to hold. Finally, the doors opened again. The doctor returned, followed closely by the father. His face was pale, but not from fear anymore. It was something harder to read. Conflict, pride, and something he wouldn't name. Guilt. He walked past Samuel without a word, without even a glance, as if acknowledging him would be too heavy a price. Instead, he walked toward the exit, his phone already in his hand, his world already moving on. The doctor, however, paused. He turned to Samuel, his eyes steady, his voice quieter this time. "You saved her life. If you hadn't acted, she wouldn't have made it." Samuel nodded, but his lips didn't part.
he didn't have the strength to speak. Gratitude from one voice could not erase the wounds carved by a room full of suspicion. He stood up slowly, thanked the doctor with the smallest nod, and began walking out of the hospital into the cool night air. Outside, the streets were calmer. The crowd had dispersed, but Samuel carried the echoes of their judgment with him. Each step home felt heavier than the last. He thought about the father's words, "Men like you don't save children like mine." The cruelty of that sentence lingered, not because it was unexpected, but because it was the reality he had always known, laid bare in its most brutal form. When Samuel finally returned to his neighborhood, the difference in worlds struck him again. Here, the houses were smaller, paint chipped from walls, children played barefoot in the streets. Yet here, he felt seen. Neighbors waved, friends greeted him by name. No one looked through him, as though he were invisible. But even here, even surrounded by familiarity, he couldn't shake the memory of the hospital lobby, where a single act of heroism had still not been enough to erase centuries of prejudice. In the days that followed, the story spread, not as Samuel had lived it, but as others had chosen to tell it. Some whispered he had overstepped. Others suggested he had endangered the girl by carrying her the way he did. Few mentioned that without him, she might not have lived. The truth became distorted, buried under assumptions shaped by race and class. Samuel didn't defend himself. He didn't have the energy to fight against the tide of perception. Instead, he returned to work quietly, polishing the marble floors once again, wiping away fingerprints that were never his. Yet something inside him had shifted. He realized now, more than ever, that his worth could never depend on their recognition. If saving a child's life wasn't enough to change their view of him, then nothing he did would. His dignity, his humanity, would have to be rooted in something deeper. His faith, his love for his son, his belief in doing what was right, even when no one was watching, even when no one cared. And though the world continued to see him as invisible, Samuel carried a quiet strength within him, because he knew that despite everything, he had chosen to act with courage, and that choice had saved a life. But this story is not just about Samuel. It is about every man, woman, and child who has been forced to prove their humanity in a world that questions it at every turn. It is about every black worker who is overlooked until crisis strikes, every mother who worries for her child's safety, not because of what they've done, but because of how they will be perceived. It is about the countless lives shaped, restricted, and scarred by the weight of racism that still lingers, unspoken, but ever present. Think about it. What does it say about our world when a man can save a life and still be treated as a criminal? What does it reveal about us when prejudice blinds us so deeply that even an act of heroism becomes twisted into suspicion? Samuel's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Racism is not always loud. It doesn't always wear the face of violence or hate. Sometimes it's in the hesitation of a father who couldn't thank the man who saved his daughter. Sometimes it's in the whispers of a crowd who assumed the worst instead of seeing the truth. Sometimes it's in the silence of bystanders who chose not to speak up. And until we are willing to see it, to name it, to fight against it, stories like Samuel's will continue to unfold in hospitals, schools, offices, and streets around the world. So tonight, as you reflect on this story, ask yourself,
Would you have trusted Samuel? Would you have believed the worst? Or would you have seen the courage in his actions? And more importantly, when you see injustice around you, will you stay silent? Or will you choose to act? Because racism does not disappear on its own. It crumbles only when ordinary people refuse to let prejudice decide the value of a life.